All right. With that, we'll move on to our speaker today, who is the Lieutenant Governor of Iowa, Adam Gregg. He's an Iowa native from Haywarden, graduated from West Sioux High School, went to college here in Iowa at Central, where he played football, and then attended Drake Law School, was a year ahead of me in law school. So I've known him since we were both in law school together. After law school, he was in private practice with the Brown Winnick law firm in Des Moines. Then he joined the governor's office as a legislative liaison and policy advisor. In 2014, he was appointed the Iowa State Public Defender, so the head of all the public defenders in the state, running that department. And then when Governor Branstad became the ambassador to China and Kim Reynolds became governor, Mr. Gregg became the lieutenant governor. So, Lieutenant Governor Adam Gregg.
Outstanding. Well, thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate you. Thanks for the invitation to join the Rotary Club here today. It's an honor to be here with you virtually. I wish we could be together in person, but I think that day is coming sometime soon, and I really look forward to that. It's an honor. I should start out by saying that Governor Kim Reynolds sends her regards. It's an honor to represent her and represent our team and represent our state here with you today. Always great to be in conversation with folks in Jefferson and in Greene County generally. I feel like there are so many good examples of positive things in our rural communities. Anytime we're looking for an example of a community that's on the cutting edge, we can always come up in your direction and find something that we can take away, something that we can learn, something that we can bring to our other rural communities based on the work that you're doing. And so I just want to acknowledge that and let you know that we appreciate the leadership role that you and those in your communities are taking. I think that's especially true for members of the Rotary. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with Rotarians for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's hard to find a better way to gather all the key community leaders in one place than to join the Rotary Club meeting. And so I appreciate this opportunity and what it means to have such a great group of folks on the Zoom call today. But also because I want to recognize and let you know we appreciate the work that Rotarians do in the communities and the way that you find opportunities to serve those in your community. Again, I just want you to know that we appreciate you and appreciate you giving me this platform to talk about some of the things that Governor Reynolds and I are working on here during the legislative session and answer some of your questions. I was listening into the conversation before the meeting came to order, and I would offer, if we want to keep talking about books and basketball tournaments, I'm cool with that. I think I could hang with some of you on that conversation. And maybe we can dive into that on question and answer. But absent that, what I was thinking I would do today is just give you kind of an overview of some of the priorities that Governor Reynolds and I are working on here during the legislative session. And I'm not going to have 40 minutes of content for you. So what I'd like to do is leave plenty of time to answer your questions and get your thoughts on some of the things that you think we ought to be working on as well. So with that, I'll just kind of dive right in. Again, you may be aware that Governor Reynolds at the beginning of each legislative session provides the condition of the state address. It's kind of like the President's State of the Union address, but it's at the state level, and it gives the governor the opportunity to lay out what her agenda is going to be for this legislative session. So I'm going to touch on a few aspects of that agenda and go into a little bit of detail on each of those. Probably the most important thing to take away, though, is we want to use the recovery from this pandemic as an opportunity to make Iowa an even greater place to live, work, and raise a family. I think it's easy when you face a crisis like this to try to focus on just getting back to where we were prior to the pandemic. But we want to use this as a sort of a launching off point to make Iowa even better. And I think there's a number of ways that we can do that. So as I go through some of these priorities, I invite you to view them through that lens of how we can use those priorities to make our state even better. So first, to start out with, I want to talk about broadband connectivity. I think it's fitting to start with that because I happen to be the first millennial lieutenant governor in state history, which is probably a very dubious distinction, but I'm going to take it because that's what I've got. But I make that point because folks my age and younger have an expectation to be connected. I'm 37 years old. I grew up most of my life being able to be connected, most of my life being on computers and what have you. And I can tell you that's a dynamic that has only gotten more and more true for younger generations. So if we want young people to return to our rural communities or to come back or stay in the first place, I think we have to meet that expectation that they be connected at all times. And so how can we do that? Because we're not doing the best job of that right now. And I would also say it's more than just sort of the ability to stream Netflix and binge watch your favorite show, or the ability of, my kids are playing online with their friends, playing Fortnite or Among Us or what have you, all these fun games that they can play. Now that's important, that's a quality of life aspect, but I tell you, connectivity has been important for business, for agriculture, for education. It's the way that we are able to participate in the modern economy. And that was all true before COVID. Now, what about here during and after COVID? I think it's become even more true. You think about how much of our economy has moved online. You think about how, from a business perspective, we've had more people teleworking than ever before. Just a quick example from state government. We had agencies, massive agencies, that employ thousands or tens of thousands of people that had effectively prohibited teleworking. And over the course of a few days or a week, they transitioned totally to being online. And you think about that, when that necessity came and that innovation came, we were ready to do that. You think about telehealth. So much of our healthcare system has moved towards telehealth here during the pandemic. It started out as a way that we could protect our frontline healthcare workers and our doctors by not exposing them to potentially ill individuals when they could see them and diagnose whatever was ailing them through telehealth. But you think about what that could mean going forward. You think about the access that it could provide to specialty care, to mental health care, those types of things. I think there's great promise through telehealth. And of course, online education, which was a necessity back last spring, and there are some that have continued that, and I could go on and on about that aspect of it. But the point is, none of that is possible without connectivity. And for those families and those communities that aren't connected, they miss out on those opportunities, whether it's participating in the modern economy, whether it's being able to participate in the classroom when the time and necessity arises, or whether it's accessing telehealth or other types of care. So Governor Reynolds this year, accounting for all those factors, decided that we're going to go bold on broadband connectivity. And she's proposing a 3-year plan with $450 million of investment in broadband connectivity. That would be in the form of matching grants, so it would draw down hundreds of millions of dollars or more in private investment. I think that's really important. And just for a little context, past 2 years, we've sought broadband grant funds at the state level and received $5 million each year. So to go from $5 million a year to $150 million a year for 3 years, I think demonstrates how we're trying to go bold, and I think it demonstrates how big of a priority it is and it should be for our state. So that's broadband connectivity. Another big challenge that we face in Iowa, and I'm sure you feel it in your community as well, is a shortage of housing. And housing has been a challenge on a number of different fronts. Number one, we just don't have quite enough of it. And there are some communities in some counties where there hasn't been a new housing start in decades, if you can believe that. And it becomes a real challenge. It's hard for a community to grow and recruit new citizens if there's not a nice place to live. It's a challenge on the workforce side. Lots of times there's jobs available in the local businesses, perhaps the local manufacturer. But if there's not a nice place to live, it can be hard to recruit somebody to fill that position. And oftentimes what ends up happening is you've got folks that are commuting long distances, sometimes 45 minutes, 60 minutes each day, each way, to take those jobs. And what ends up happening is they get a job a little bit closer to home that saves them a little bit of time, and suddenly that's now an open position for the local employer. The other thing that I think housing represents for us is an opportunity for economic recovery. Housing is often considered one of the great ways to drive investment and create jobs. And so by focusing our investments on housing, and specifically rural housing, we can drive our economic recovery at the same time. So again, we're going big on housing. And so there's kind of a housing omnibus package that we're proposing, and I'm going to spare you from going into all the details, but let me just highlight one piece of it, and that's the workforce housing tax credit. This has been a very special program for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's been highly effective at driving investment in our rural communities. In fact, in some ways, for a while there, it was too effective. We had a 5-year waiting list for projects that were eligible for the workforce housing tax credit. So a few years ago, we dedicated $25 million all in 1 year to clear that 5-year backlog. The other thing to understand is in this tax credit, it's special because there's a rural set-aside, meaning a portion of the funds for that housing tax credit have to go to the least populous 88 counties in our state, which I think is a really important way to structure programs so that we're making sure that all this funding and all this investment doesn't just happen in our big cities and our thriving suburbs, but it goes into our rural communities as well. So in previous years, we've doubled that rural set-aside. What Governor Reynolds is proposing on a go-forward basis is to double the entire workforce housing tax credit program and double the rural set-aside at the same time, meaning $20 million of a $50 million program will be dedicated to our rural communities. And that's just the tax credit portion of it. That doesn't factor in the amount of private investment that will go into housing in our rural communities as a result of that. I know that this is something that has been used in your area. In fact, just last fall, maybe it was last summer, I visited a workforce housing tax credit that's going on in Jefferson and was pleased to see the work happening there. And it's an older building that's being renovated into apartments. And so it's going to be a really good thing. So we always like to see that. I guess the third point I'd make here in terms of priorities goes back to workforce. And I'd like to invite you to step back 1 year ago at this time, March 1st of 2020. Pandemic hadn't hit Iowa yet. We didn't even have a single positive case of COVID-19 in the state of Iowa 1 year ago today. And what was our biggest problem at that time was that we had more jobs than we had people to fill them. We had extremely low unemployment. We were down, I think, at that time at 2.7, 2.8%. And we're kind of getting back to the point where that's one of our biggest challenges again. We're at 3.1% as we speak today. And so we're back to a challenge where many of our employers have jobs available, but they either can't find folks to fill those jobs, or if they can find folks, they don't have the right skills to be able to fill them. So we have made this a major priority for our administration over the course of the nearly 4 years that we've been in these roles. Governor Reynolds created a program called Future Ready Iowa, and the overall goal is to make sure that 70% of our workforce has education or training beyond high school by the year 2025. Because based on projections and calculations, that's the level of training that's going to be necessary to fill jobs. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a 4-year degree for all of those. Oftentimes what that can mean is a 2-year community college degree. It can be another type of training, like an apprenticeship program, where folks can earn while they learn, while also doing some work in the classroom and also getting on-the-job experience. There's also other types of training, like certificate programs and those types of things that can be very effective at getting Iowans the skills they need to fill those jobs that maybe they don't quite get to in high school, but they're able to gain that with even a relatively minimal amount of training, 6 months, maybe a year. And so we've made numerous investments into those types of programs. One of the things that we're really talking about this year, though, is making sure that at the high school level, that there's an expectation that every student has the opportunity to have a work-based learning experience. And that can take a variety of different forms. It can be a job shadowing opportunity. It can be a career academy being available for them. Obviously, you have the Forge in Jefferson, which is a very unique and great opportunity for students to gain a specific skill set. But we want to make sure that that's an expectation for every child's education all throughout our state. And so we're going to continue to focus on that, continue to make investments in Future Ready Iowa programs that drive students to that higher level of education, whether it's at the community college, whether it's at one of our Regents universities or private schools, or whether it's maybe a non-traditional type of training like an apprenticeship, like a skills certification. So with that, I could go on and on here all day, but I want to let you drive the conversation and open this up to questions. Those are three of our main priorities for this year. They're big ones: broadband, we're talking housing, we're talking workforce development, but there are so many other things as well, and I want to hear what's on your mind. So with that, I'll open it up to your questions.
Nobody has a question, and maybe I'll jump in real quick. Lieutenant Governor, I didn't read the whole thing, but I read the report that came out a few weeks ago about the future of Iowa. You had the guy from Ruan and everybody else, that big committee, and it was really good stuff. The one thing I didn't see, but I may not have seen it in there because I haven't read it all, but is there something that the government's going to do to help Main Street, such as the local grocery store, the local restaurant, the local stores there? They probably struggle more in this pandemic than anybody else. So is there something for them or something for them to look forward to that's on your guys' radar or plan that you have?
Well, thank you. Appreciate that question. And what Travis is referring to there is the governor put together a task force called the Governor's Economic Recovery Advisory Board. And really that was the part of that concept of saying that we need to come back better and stronger than before. So what she did was convened a group of business leaders and community leaders from all across the state and tasked them really with no restraints to say, hey, how would you recommend we go big in a recovery? And it was, I think it was smart to bring business leaders and folks from there were definitely folks from within government, but largely folks outside of government, because sometimes those of us in government can be constrained by what we think is possible. And so instead, she brought in outside business leaders and said, what would you do? How could we really step up and do this? And really, a lot of their recommendations are what I just described to you. Their number one recommendation was to make investments in broadband connectivity. Because you think about it, it's so important for every corner of our state. We've got, Jefferson, I think, is a pretty well-connected community. That's not true in every rural community in our state, and we need to make sure that we're driving investment to those areas. There's also places, frankly, in Des Moines that don't have the level of connectivity that some of our small towns do. So that's where broadband came from. It was the same thing on housing. I mentioned to you that we think housing can be a real driver of an overall economic recovery. Well, that comes directly from the Governor's Economic Recovery Advisory Board and the work that they did. Your question was about rural main streets and what we can do to help them. First of all, I would argue that both of those things, more broadly, help our rural communities as well. I talked about how there's a specific set aside for our rural communities in the workforce housing tax credit. When we're driving investment into our rural communities, that gives more people an opportunity to stay and live there. It means more investment. It means more support for those downtown businesses. Same thing with connectivity. You can sell a product anywhere in the world as long as you're connected. And so I don't want to discount the impact that those two big investments can have on rural communities. One of the hats that I wear in my role as Lieutenant Governor is to chair the Governor's Empower Rural Iowa initiative. And your question brings to mind some of the work that we've done there. There's numerous programs throughout state government that can help support our rural main streets. You may be involved in the Main Street Iowa program. I know there are dozens of communities across the state. Really great way to number one, shape a vision for what a rural downtown should look like, to get special access to different programs and grant funding that's available to improve the downtown. And so that's really great. We've also looked at, there's a number of programs that support renovating older buildings. Well, I come from small town of Haywarden, far northwest corner of the state. I know one of the challenges and also one of the opportunities in our rural communities are some of these older buildings that are kind of teetering on the edge, right? Are they ready? Are we at a point where they just need to be knocked down and we need to start over again? But the problem with that is there's usually a lot of history and a lot of character in those buildings. And so with a little bit of investment and a little bit of help, a little bit of state grant support along with some private funding, maybe that's something that can be renovated and turned into something new, a nice new restaurant or something like that. And so we've tried to dedicate additional funds to those programs and make them more easily accessible, particularly for our rural communities. Sometimes that means having slightly different standards in terms of the level of investment that needs to go in there. There's another program called the Community Catalyst Program. I believe Jefferson has utilized that a few times. One of the key aspects of that is we want there to be a housing element to it as well. So oftentimes what it means is $100,000 of grant funding goes to renovate the building, but you also have to do upper story housing with it or something like that. Great way to, again, deal with the housing issue, deal with a building that's maybe crumbling, but that you really don't want to come down, and also drive some more investment into our rural main streets. I guess the last thing I'd mention is one of the things that we've had the ability to do through federal CARES Act funding is provide some lifeline funds to our small businesses across the state. And that came generally at a time before the big PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, was available. And the piece of feedback that we constantly hear from our business owners is that that was the right thing at just the right time that kept them going as kind of a bridge to that PPP program. And then with additional CARES Act funding, we've tried to target businesses that have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, like bars and restaurants in particular, those service industries where there is a great amount of hesitancy and less patronage than there normally would be. So Travis, your point is very well taken. We're always focused on driving that investment in our rural communities because it's such an important aspect of who we are as a state of Iowa. And I'm proud to wear that hat as the chair of the Empower Rural Iowa Initiative and get to think about that every day. I thought Susan was wanting to ask a question earlier.
Yeah, I was muted, so it's always a problem with these Zoom calls. I just was wondering if I can ask you a question about education. So I teach part-time at Iowa State, so this doesn't affect me directly, but I'm really passionate about higher ed and education more generally. Do you have any feelings about some of the proposals to do away with tenure at Iowa universities? Because I do worry that that's going to create a massive brain drain that the academic job market is such that people may apply to those jobs initially, but that they'll stay a few years and get out as quickly as they can. So I just don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
We're very proud of higher education in our state. I think our Regents universities are top notch. Our community colleges, I just talked about how much investment we've driven into the community colleges. Same thing with our private colleges and universities as well, with the Iowa Tuition Grant, which helps folks of lesser means be able to access that level of education. So we're proud of what we're doing in education. And I guess what I would say regarding some of those proposals that you see out there is those aren't the priorities that we're focused on. And so we tend to hesitate to comment on those things until they have proven to have the kind of legs to get through a subcommittee, a committee, through both chambers and ultimately to the governor's desk. So what we do is we focus our capital on the things that we think will help move the state forward. And I've talked about some of those things here today: broadband, housing, et cetera. So again, we're proud of our record on education and want to continue the progress that we've made.
Thanks.
I've got a question here, also dealing with education. One of the planks of the traditional Republican Party is fewer regulations from the top to try and solve problems at the local level. What's coming out of the legislature seems that they want to be the grand school board in Des Moines and micromanage the districts in the state. You want to comment on that?
Well, I think you make a fair point. I think there's always a constant balance between local control and state level rules and regulations. And I feel like we're always, this year the issue does appear to be education, where a lot of that debate has been focused, but oftentimes there's other areas where that issue has come up. I think about a few years ago when the issue of the minimum wage, and you had some cities and some counties that were trying to set a different minimum wage in part of the state versus having one statewide rule. And so that was an area where I think folks decided that it probably makes sense to have a statewide rule. In education, I think we're constantly having that debate on different issues, and that balance gets struck differently depending on what that issue is. And so again, I do think we're at a point in the legislative session where there's a lot of ideas that are out there, but there's only a fraction of those that are actually going to make their way through a subcommittee, through a committee, through one chamber, and do the same process in the other chamber and ultimately make it to the governor. And so we're constantly trying to strike that balance. I think it's different on every issue broadly, and I think it sometimes can be different on every issue within an issue like education. But I also, I guess, should say that why are those questions coming up? Why are we talking about that? Well, we had some real challenges in education this year, and I think we should probably acknowledge that fact. When you've got the largest, most diverse school district in the state, which essentially did not meet in person for an entire semester, that poses a real challenge. It poses a real challenge for the students that didn't get the education that they deserve and that their parents should frankly expect. It poses a challenge for us when it comes to mental health and what the impact that is for the students who weren't able to get out and socialize. I don't know what your local community school district was like, but my home school district was back every day from the very beginning in August. And they serve students well, in my opinion. And so one of the key pieces of legislation, which perhaps you had in mind when you raised this question, was a piece that requires 100% in-person option for students. We provided in Iowa law that school districts could provide a 100% online option, which might be right for some students and some families. But we found that it was also very important that there be a 100% in-person option for those families who can't afford to take a semester off or a whole school year off, or who can't afford to have school just every other day, or who don't think it's appropriate for their student to, I could go on and on with many examples. We've spoken with families and with students and with parents who were not satisfied with 100% virtual or even the hybrid options. And so we felt it was important that there be a provision in Iowa law to say that there must be 100% in-person option available. So you might criticize that as saying, well, that's the state giving up on local control. But I would also say that I feel like as a state, we have a responsibility to make sure that our students and parents are heard and that they have an opportunity for the education that they deserve. And so, again, constant balance, arguments on both sides. You might find arguments on both sides persuasive, but that's how these issues get presented to us, and they're very weighty issues. We didn't feel like we could let students go potentially another entire semester without being in the classroom. And I think the legislature shared that view. I think it was the first bill that the governor signed this legislative session. That's how much we heard about it from citizens of Iowa.
Governor Gregg, I think most Iowans that are connected are becoming very familiar with Zoom. I can remember the old days of loading in the car, driving an hour and a half, finding a parking place and tromping up the hill to go to the Capitol to come see you personally. I really prefer this, and I hope that we learn the lesson of trying to perfect this process, that some meetings can be conducted this way. I would even like to attend some committee meetings by Zoom to see what the hell they do in those rooms to come up with some of the decisions that they do. So I would encourage you to use it to expand access to state government, local government in the state of Iowa, and to make the citizenry more able to participate in the democracy.
Jim, thank you for that point. I'm going to disagree with you on one aspect of it and agree with you on another. I'm going to disagree in that I don't prefer this. You know, I do prefer to have the opportunity to come to a Rotary Club and meet with you in person and look you in the eye and shake your hand and not feel sheepish about that. And it allows me to get out in the state, all those types of things. I also think it allows for legislators to be able to hear more directly from their constituents and all that. Where I agree with you, though, is I think that there is some good that's going to come from normalization of doing things virtually, including the opportunity to incorporate virtual participation in future meetings, whether that's, you know, the legislature decides how they're going to conduct their meetings. But I just think about like my Empower Rural Iowa task force that I work with. We had all of our meetings virtually this year. We had the best attendance of the membership that we've ever had. And I would argue that we were probably more accessible to members of the general public and the media than we otherwise would have been. And some of that was because we have our meetings in rural Iowa. And for some of our members who are from rural Iowa, that can mean like a 7-hour drive if you're going from one corner of the state to the other. And lots of times they just wouldn't be in a position to make that drive. And so instead, by meeting virtually, we were able to get better participation. And so while I don't prefer it, Jim, I am glad that we do have this opportunity, that it's become normalized. I think it makes state government more accessible, makes local government more accessible, and I hope that we continue to utilize it to the best of our ability, even when we get back to normal.
I think we could think of it as Iowa C-SPAN. And we could have, you know, the citizen could say, I don't want to talk. I want to just listen to what is being talked about.
You know what? And because of this, there's actually been investment made in the legislature to make the committee meetings more accessible. For the past multiple years, even prior to the pandemic, they live stream the debate on the floor of the House and Senate. But of course, a lot of the work and a lot of the discussion happens at the subcommittee and the committee level. And so they actually utilized some CARES Act dollars that the governor allocated to the legislature to equip the committee rooms with cameras and microphones and all those things to make this possible. And so they're doing subcommittees that way, and hopefully, because now they've got the technology, it's not like we need to make more investment. It's just a matter of keeping up the technology. Hopefully, we continue to be have that level of accessibility going forward.
Thank you.
I'll just carry on with the technology a little bit. Please indulge me as I give you just a little bit of history and brag some more about Jefferson. We are fortunate here to have Jefferson Telecom, who has brought fiber to all of our homes and all of that. And back in '93, they made it possible for the Greene County Medical Center to do a telemedicine demonstration with, well, it was then Iowa Methodist, with a patient here, cardiologist in Des Moines, and it was a wonderful exhibition of how that telemedicine could take place. They had live feeds of the EKG and all of that. Well, what happened was there was a flood in Des Moines, and so there was virtually zero press, zero coverage about this event. But what it did was show that through the ICN, we were able to demonstrate that. And then it got kind of bogged down with insurance and who's going to pay for what and all of that. But anyway, Jefferson and Greene County has been on the cutting edge of so much technology. And as you're seeing even now, I mean, we've had a history of this for some time. Okay, my other passion is I know that the state is supportive of childcare, and childcare is crucial to economic development, especially in small communities. So I want to give you a chance to talk about that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for both of those points. Again, another great example of Jefferson being on the leading edge of so many of these issues, talking about telemedicine back in 1993. That's pretty incredible. And think how far we've come since then, and the advances even that we've made in the past year, right, since the pandemic, and how normalized telemedicine has become, and what that can mean going forward. That's a huge deal. I appreciate you mentioning childcare. It's one of the priority issues that I didn't get the opportunity to talk about in my main remarks, but this is a really important issue for a lot of reasons. First of all, as a young father, right, I've got kids that are in 4th grade and 2nd grade. We aren't that far removed from the time of paying for childcare. And when we had both kids in daycare, I can tell you we were paying significantly more in daycare per month than we were on our mortgage. And that's a real challenge for young families, and we probably ought to acknowledge that fact. The other challenge is there's just less and less of them. I saw a stat the other day, in the last 5 years, we've lost something like 42% of our child care slots all across the state. And I think that probably got worse during the pandemic rather than better. And this touches on so many aspects. I mentioned housing in the context of workforce, right? Hard to recruit somebody if there's not a nice place to live. You can also say it's hard to recruit somebody to come to town if there isn't childcare that's available, and there isn't professional childcare that folks really can feel confident in sending their child to. So it's really important that we drive that type of investment. The other thing that it effectively means is that there are folks who are not in the workforce today who would probably prefer to be in the workforce, but instead have to deal with childcare at home, whether that's a mother staying home or in some cases a father as well. And so it touches on workforce in so many different ways as well. So this is something that's worthy of the legislature's attention. It's certainly worthy of our administration's attention. And so we're doing a couple of different things to try to drive access for childcare in the state of Iowa. Governor created an employer innovation fund with a child care challenge. And basically what this is, it's a grant fund to partner with local businesses, for example, or perhaps a local chamber organization that wants to partner with the private sector to create some child care slots that would be available. We've seen this in other rural communities where one of the major employers decides, hey, this is a barrier to our growth. This is keeping potential workers out of the workforce. We're going to go ahead and offer childcare in our community. And some businesses have gone so far as to purchase abandoned school buildings and basically use them as childcare. And even though they didn't necessarily want to be in the business of providing childcare, they decided to do so and decided it was in their interest. So we want to encourage those types of private sector and local partnerships so that kind of thing can happen. So we've created this Child Care Challenge Fund that will allow for some state matching dollars in order to get that built. There's also been a massive amount of federal money that's available going into child care through Child Care CDBG funds, it's called, $25 million going into that to help new child care programs start up. And we also are trying to address the cost side of things, particularly for low-income families, by expanding eligibility for child care tax credits, and also trying to deal with what we call the cliff effect, where very small amounts of increased income can result in losing far more in benefits, and it becomes a barrier and a bit of a trap for families that are of lower income to be able to get, we've been talking a lot about additional training, right, and moving another rung up the ladder. Well, there are also some unfortunate disincentives to that. And so trying to address that and dedicating some funds to easing that cliff effect on the child care front. But this is a really sticky challenge, right? It's a sticky wicket, if you will, because you hear from daycare providers who say that they really don't make enough money to be able to make it work, which is why we've lost 42% of the slots over the course of the past 5 years. You hear from parents, and I've lived it, and I'm sure some of you have as well, where it's so expensive already, and so it's kind of hard. How do you square those two, where parents can't afford it, but yet operators can't make enough money to keep doing it? It's a real challenging situation. And then also you've got the workforce side of things. even from the daycare perspective, where they struggle to pay enough in wages to recruit high quality workers. So it's one of those things that has a lot of facets to the challenge, but we're trying to make progress kind of on all sides of that one. So thank you for asking that.
Governor,
Can I make a?
go ahead,
Oh,
please.
go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, I had thought that maybe throughout the course of this, I would have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the vaccine administration process here in Iowa. I thought that might come up through questions, and so I just wanted to share, that we're on the right track. I mean, the biggest challenge from vaccine administration has been the demand for it vastly outstripping the supply, right? And when you take a step back for a moment and you just think, again, a year ago at this time, we didn't have a single positive case in Iowa. And now, for this virus, there wasn't a treatment, there really wasn't testing, there certainly wasn't a vaccine. And now here we are less than a year later, and there are now 3 vaccines that are approved. And we've got over 700,000 Iowans who have received at least 1 dose of the vaccine. This weekend, the Johnson & Johnson 1-dose vaccine was approved. That's a huge deal. We already have 25,000 of those coming to the state of Iowa, and that's going to start making an impact generally. Another thing that I found really kind of interesting is the fact that we now have far more people in Iowa who have received at least 1 dose of vaccine than have ever tested positive for the coronavirus throughout the entire pandemic. You don't necessarily hear that narrative out there, but to me, I found that kind of a really interesting statistic, is to say, okay, we really are starting to make progress here, and you can really start to see light at the end of the tunnel, as was mentioned in the prayer at the beginning. You start to have that optimism and that positivity as we get more and more supply to meet the demand that's out there for Iowans on these vaccines. And so I guess I just wanted to make that point that as supply is opening up, we're getting those vaccines into the arms of Iowans, and it's going to make a big difference going forward. Sorry, Rick, I didn't mean to step on your question.
No. What you had to say was very important, Governor. My question is, the priorities that you've laid out are certainly commendable, and I hope that we're able to pull them off as a state, especially with the emphasis on rural Iowa. The other needs are ongoing as well for the state and for all the corners of it. I don't see last year or in the last couple of years, the majority party in the legislature took credit for the biggest tax cut in Iowa history. And now we have all these needs, especially the ones you're talking about. And once again, they're talking about trying to cut taxes. I don't see how those 2 goals mesh. How can you improve the lives of Iowans along the lines that you're talking about with less money coming in?
Well, I actually think by letting Iowans keep more of their money, they're going to be able to invest in their businesses, be able to decide how they want to spend those dollars, and that will provide an improvement to the economy. I'd also say that we're able to, every year, Governor and I have to submit a budget to the legislature for consideration. And one of the things that's required is that, unlike the federal government, we can't print money and we can't be out of balance. And so we have to be able to afford the investments that we're talking about, including tax cuts, and be able to have that pencil out and have our revenues be higher than what our expenditures are. We have to have that balanced budget. And so when I talk about $450 million going to broadband connectivity, we know we can make that work in our budget because we did all that work ahead of time to make sure that it actually works. Now that's why we're proposing it as a 3-year program, but we can make that pencil out. Same thing with our overall budget. I mean, in Iowa, we're in a pretty good spot, and I would argue it's because we've made a lot of really difficult decisions in prioritizing funding at the state level. There's a lot of good ideas out there, meritorious ideas that sometimes you wish you could make investments in, but sometimes you have to draw the line somewhere. And so I think we've done a pretty good job of striking that balance. Our education funding's never been higher. Roughly 55% of our general fund budget goes to education spending in the state of Iowa. I think that's an important priority, and we continue to do that. But even then, and even after we've dealt with this pandemic, we have a balanced budget, we have cash reserves that are full, and we have a surplus on top of that. What does that mean for everyday Iowans? Well, it means that we aren't in the position that some other states are, who spend more than they take in or spend nearly everything that they take in on an annual basis. And they're now facing tough decisions. When they had revenues crumble during the pandemic, that means that they have to go back and make some significant cuts, perhaps to education. We see that with our neighbors. We haven't had to do that because we've been able to keep our promises. I think that's an important aspect of it that maybe is underappreciated. We aren't in the position in other states where they have to find ways to create new revenue, including by increasing taxes. I think it's hard to come out of an economic downturn by increasing taxes. So instead, in Iowa, again, going back to that point of trying to build and make Iowa an even better place, we think if we can make this a lower tax state, that it will drive more investment in our state, keep more people here. And so I'm proud of our record on the budget. I'm glad that we're prioritizing the things we are. It does work in our budget projections, and I'm glad to be in a position where we're talking about continuing to increase funding to education, continuing to increase funding to broadband, to workforce housing tax credits, to all those things, while also being able to have a conversation about potentially accelerating the tax cuts that have already been passed in previous years. Those things aren't in conflict. We can make that work in our priorities.
All right, we're at 1 o'clock. So thank you, Lieutenant Governor Gregg.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you all for tuning in. I look forward to coming